April 1945. Berlin was a city of fire and iron. The Soviet artillery was so close that the vibrations could be felt in the deepest foundations of the Führer bunker. While high-ranking officials were burning their documents and choosing their final exit, Admiral Wilhelm von Zeller was doing something far more strategic. He wasn't preparing to die. He was preparing to disappear. Von Zeller was not just a naval commander. He was the keeper of the Kriegs-Archiv, the secret naval archives that contained the locations of every strategic asset the regime had scattered across the globe. Witnesses at the Baltic port of Kiel described a man who looked remarkably composed. Amidst the chaos of refugees and retreating soldiers, von Zeller boarded the U-2022, a specialized type IXC submarine. But this wasn't a standard patrol vessel. It had been modified. Its torpedo tubes were removed to make room for heavy, lead-lined crates, and its crew consisted only of men who had no living family. As the sirens wailed and the last of the German defenses crumbled, the U-2022 slipped beneath the waves of the Baltic Sea. It was never heard from again. No distress signal, no wreckage, no oil slick. The Admiral and his secret archive had simply ceased to exist. For 77 years, the fate of Wilhelm von Zeller remained a ghost case. British and American intelligence spent decades searching for his trail in Argentina, Spain, and even Antarctica, believing he had escaped to start a new life. But history has a way of staying buried until the Earth decides to reveal it. The breakthrough didn't happen because of a historian's research. It happened because of a routine underwater inspection for a new transcontinental internet cable in 2022. A deep-sea autonomous underwater vehicle, AUV, equipped with synthetic aperture sonar, was scanning the seabed off the coast of a remote Norwegian fjord, an area officially declared empty by naval charts. At a depth of 450 meters, the sonar pinged back an echo that was too symmetrical to be a rock. It was a long, cylindrical shadow, partially buried in the silt, leaning at a 45-degree angle. When the modern salvage team sent down a remotely operated vehicle, ROV, with 4K cameras, the world caught its first glimpse of the U-2022. The hull was covered in rustic glass, long, icicle-like growths of oxidized iron, but the structural integrity was terrifyingly intact. As the ROV moved toward the conning tower, the lights revealed a nameplate that sent a shudder through the control room. It wasn't just the Admiral's boat. It was his coffin, but it was the state of the submarine that confused the experts. There were no holes from torpedoes, no signs of a depth charge attack. The hatches were sealed from the inside. However, as the camera panned toward the stern, they saw something that changed the narrative of the entire war. The metal around the engine room hadn't been crushed by water pressure. It had been melted from the inside out. The Admiral hadn't been hiding from the Allies. He had been hiding from something inside his own ship. And as the ROV's mechanical arm brushed away the silt from the command bridge's glass port, the team saw a flickering light. A faint, rhythmic pulse of blue energy coming from the heart of a vessel that had been dead for nearly 8 decades. The control room of the salvage ship, the Orion, was silent, save for the hum of the cooling fans and the rhythmic ping of the sonar. On the main monitor, the 4K feed from the ROV showed a sight that defied every law of maritime engineering. The U-2022 sat in the crushing darkness, 450 meters below the surface, yet its interior was emitting a faint, rhythmic blue luminescence. It wasn't the glow of a fire or a short circuit. It was steady, pulsating like a heartbeat. "That's impossible," the lead engineer whispered. "Batteries from 1945 would have dissolved decades ago. There is no power source on Earth that stays active underwater for 77 years. Dr. Julian Vane, The team's lead historian leaned in closer to the screen. He wasn't looking at the light. He was looking at the hull. He noticed that the rusticless and sea life that usually cover shipwrecks were strangely absent from the area around the command bridge. The metal there was polished, almost surgically clean. It was as if the blue energy was creating a field that repelled the very ocean itself. Using the ROV's hydraulic manipulator arm, they began the delicate process of clearing the silt around the main hatch. They expected to find the rusted, jammed wheel of a 77-year-old door. Instead, as the mechanical claw touched the handle, the hatch didn't just move, it hissed. A stream of bubbles escaped, but they weren't air bubbles. They were heavy, metallic-looking spheres that sank toward the seabed instead of rising to the surface. That's liquid mercury, Vane realized, his voice trembling. He didn't just modify the torpedo tubes. He turned the entire U-boat into a massive, pressurized mercury-vortex engine. As the hatch swung open, the ROV's powerful LED lights flooded the interior of the U-2022. The scene inside was frozen in time, but not in the way they expected. The crew wasn't at their stations, and there were no remains of the men who had vanished with the Admiral. The command center was empty, but the walls were covered in intricate, hand-drawn diagrams etched directly into the steel. In the center of the room, bolted to the floor, was a lead-line cylinder. The blue light was emanating from its core. Beside it sat Admiral Von Zeller's personal logbook, resting on a pedestal as if waiting to be read. Dr. Vane used the ROV's delicate pincers to turn the first page. The paper was dry, a physical impossibility at this depth, protected by the same strange energy field. The entry was dated May 4th, 1945. The Reich has fallen, but the archive is safe. We are no longer heading for Argentina. The Kriegs-Archiv is not a collection of papers. It is a coordinate for the fold. The mercury is stable. My crew has already transitioned. I am the last one to remain in this dimension. If this vessel is ever found, do not attempt to open the cylinder. The blue light is not a signal, it is a tether. Transition. Vane repeated the word, a cold knot forming in his stomach. What did he mean by the fold? The ROV moved deeper into the sub, toward the engine room where the metal had melted. There, they found the answer. The engine wasn't a diesel-electric motor. It was a massive, rotating sphere of glass and gold wire, suspended in a bath of glowing mercury. In the center of the sphere, suspended in midair, was a set of iron keys and a small, silver compass. The needle of the compass wasn't pointing north. It was spinning rapidly, reacting to a magnetic field that shouldn't exist. Suddenly, the blue pulse intensified. The salvage ship above began to rock violently. On the surface, the calm Norwegian fjord was churning into a whirlpool. The ROV's sensors started screaming. The water temperature around the U-boat was dropping at an impossible rate. It went from 4 degrees Celsius to minus 20 degrees Celsius in seconds, yet the water didn't freeze. It turned into a thick, gelatinous state. On the monitor, a shadow moved across the background of the U-boat's engine room. It wasn't a fish. It was the silhouette of a man in an admiral's overcoat, standing perfectly still in the corner of the frame. He wasn't a ghost. He looked solid, but his image flickered like a television with bad reception. He looked directly into the ROV's camera and raised a hand. In his palm was a second silver compass, its needle pointing directly at the salvage ship above. The Admiral hadn't fled Berlin to hide in the world. He had fled to hide between it. And the salvage team had just cut the tether that kept him there. The silhouette of Admiral Von Zeller on the monitor didn't just linger, it solidified. The static around his image smoothed out, revealing the sharp lines of his 1945 naval uniform, untouched by time or the crushing pressure of the Atlantic. In the control room of the Orion, the crew sat in paralyzed silence. The depth gauge still read 450 meters, but the external cameras showed the water had turned into a shimmering, violet fog. "Get that ROV out of there now," Dr. Vane shouted, breaking the trance. The pilot slammed the joysticks into reverse, but the ROV didn't budge. The tether, the reinforced fiber optic cable connecting the drone to the ship, was vibrating so violently it hummed like a guitar string. On the screen, the Admiral began to walk. His footsteps made no sound, but with every stride he took across the engine room floor, the blue pulse from the mercury cylinder intensified. "He's not a ghost," the tech specialist whispered, staring at the telemetry. "His mass is being registered by the ROV's proximity sensors. He's physically there, but he's out of sync. It's like he's a 3D object moving through a 2D world." The Admiral reached the lead-line cylinder, the heart of the blue light. He didn't use his hands to open it. He simply leaned his head against the cold metal, and the cylinder began to unfurl like a mechanical flower. Inside was the Kriegs-Archiv. It wasn't a box of documents or gold bars. It was a single, obsidian-black sphere, no larger than a human heart, suspended in a vacuum. As the sphere was exposed, the Admiral's voice filled the control room. It didn't come through the speakers. It echoed directly inside the minds of everyone on the salvage ship. "You have disturbed the anchor." The voice resonated, cold and ancient. The mercury was the weight. The U-2022 was the cage. By opening the hatch, you have allowed the fold to bleed into your time. On the surface, the situation turned critical. The salvage ship, the Orion, was no longer in the Norwegian fjord. The GPS coordinates on the bridge were spinning wildly. Outside the windows, the familiar pine-covered cliffs had vanished, replaced by a gray, endless void. The sky was neither day nor night, but a bruised shade of purple. They had been pulled into the fold, the dimension Von Zeller had escaped to in 1945. Dr. Vane grabbed the radio, trying to reach the shore base, but all he heard was the sound of Morse code. Fast, frantic, and repetitive. He recognized it instantly from his naval history training. It was the distress signal of the U-2022, sent 77 years ago, finally catching up to the present. "We are not alone in the deep," the Morse code translated. "The archive is a doorway. The mercury is the key. Tell the Admiralty, do not look for us." In the sunken U-boat, the Admiral turned back to the ROV camera. His face, which had been stoic, now showed a flicker of intense urgency. He pointed toward the obsidian sphere. "The archive is a map of the others," the Admiral's voice echoed. "The thousands who fled like me. We are not the only ones waiting in the fold. If this sphere reaches the surface, the door remains open. You must reseal the hatch. You must sink the Orion to bridge the gap." Suddenly, the obsidian sphere began to grow. Dark, oily tendrils started to emerge from its surface, reaching toward the ROV's lens. These tendrils weren't made of matter. They looked like cracks in reality itself. Wherever they touched the submarine's steel, the metal simply ceased to exist, leaving behind a perfectly circular hole into nothingness. "He's not protecting the archive from us," Vane realized, horror dawning on him. "He's trying to stop whatever is inside the archive from getting to us." The blue light began to turn a sickly, dark red. The Admiral's silhouette started to fade, his energy being consumed by the sphere. With his last bit of strength, he threw his silver compass toward the ROV's mechanical claw. "Follow the needle," he commanded. "It is the only thing that points back to your world. But hurry, the others have smelled the opening." As the compass hit the claw, a deafening roar shook the submarine. From the dark corners of the engine room, where the light couldn't reach, dozens of smaller, faster shadows began to emerge. They weren't human. They were the others, entities that had been trapped in the fold with the U-boat, waiting for a way out. The engine room of the U-2022, once a tomb of silent blue light, was now a chaotic arena of shifting shadows. These were the others the Admiral had warned about, creatures of the fold that looked like distorted reflections of deep-sea predators, shimmering with an oil-slick iridescent glow. They moved through the waterless interior of the sub as if gravity were a suggestion, their elongated limbs scraping against the hull with the sound of screeching metal. On the Orion, the crew watched in horror as the ROV's feed flickered. The dark tendrils from the obsidian sphere were now wrapping around the drone's frame. The temperature in the control room began to drop so rapidly that frost formed on the monitors. "The compass!" Dr. Vane shouted. "Focus the camera on the silver compass." The ROV's pilot maneuvered the mechanical claw. The silver compass Von Zeller had thrown was unlike any modern instrument. Its face was etched with non-Euclidean geometry, and the needle wasn't made of steel. It was a sliver of glowing mercury, suspended in a vacuum glass. While every other digital instrument on the Orion had flatlined or spun in circles, this needle was locked onto a single point in the gray void outside. "They are not hunters," the Admiral's voice echoed, now faint and strained. "They are scavengers of time. They feed on the anchor, the memories of our world that we brought into the fold. If they reach the tether, they will climb it to the surface." As he spoke, one of the shadows lunged at the ROV. The camera caught a glimpse of a face, a terrifying fusion of a human sailor and a deep-sea viper. It didn't bite the drone. It began to drink the light from the ROV's LEDs. The screen grew darker, the high-definition image dissolving into grainy static. "They're draining the energy," the tech specialist cried. "If we lose power to the ROV, the tether collapses. We'll be stranded in this void forever." Dr. Vane grabbed the intercom. "Bridge. Follow that needle's orientation. Whatever direction that silver compass is pointing, steer the ship that way. It's our only bridge back to the fjord." But the ship wouldn't move. The engines were screaming, but the Orion was anchored by the fiber optic cable still connected to the U-boat. The ROV was stuck in the obsidian sphere's gravity well. Inside the submarine, the Admiral made a final, desperate move. He walked directly into the center of the dark tendrils. As he touched the obsidian sphere, his solid form began to dissolve into pure white light. He was using his own anchor, his 77 years of memories and his very existence, as a flare to distract the scavengers. "Go!" the voice roared in their heads. "Sever the connection. The archive must stay here. The door must close." "We can't leave the ROV," the pilot protested. "That's a $10 million piece of equipment." "Cut the cable," Vane ordered, his voice echoing the Admiral's urgency. "If those things follow the cable up, $10 million will be the least of our worries." "Cut it now." The deckhand hit the emergency release. With a violent snap, the fiber optic tether was severed. On the monitor, the last thing they saw was the Admiral's white light being engulfed by the shadows, and the obsidian sphere shrinking back into its lead cylinder. The moment the cable snapped, the Orion lurched forward. The violet fog outside the windows began to tear like old fabric. The gray void was replaced by a blinding flash of green and blue. With a sound like a physical pop, the ship slammed back into the waters of the Norwegian fjord. The GPS blinked, regained its signal, and locked onto their exact location. The sky was dark, the pine trees were back, and the water was liquid once again. But the silence was broken by the sound of a mechanical clicking. Everyone turned to the ROV control station. The drone was gone, lost at the bottom of the sea, but the silver compass, The one the Admiral had thrown into the mechanical claw was sitting on the floor of the control room. It had somehow transitioned with the ship, and as Dr. Vane picked it up, he noticed the needle wasn't pointing north. It was pointing directly down through the floor of the ship toward the seabed where the U-2022 lay. And then the compass began to glow with a dark, sickly red light. The same light they had seen in the sphere. The silver compass felt unnaturally cold in Dr. Vane's hand, a biting chill that seemed to seep through his skin and settle in his bones. The control room of the Orion was deathly quiet, the only sound being the drip of condensation from the overhead pipes. They were back in the Norwegian fjord, back in the world of the living, but the atmosphere on the ship had changed. The air felt thin, metallic, as if the fold had left a residue on their very souls. "How did this get here?" the tech specialist whispered, staring at the compass on the floor. The ROV was 450 meters down. The cable was cut. This shouldn't be physically possible. Dr. Vane didn't answer. He watched as the mercury needle, now a dark, pulsing crimson, began to spin. It wasn't searching for a magnetic pole. It was reacting to something beneath them. Suddenly, the ship's internal intercom system crackled to life. There was no one at the bridge microphone, but a sound began to fill the corridors, a wet, rhythmic thumping, like footsteps walking through shallow water. "The anchor is gone, but the debt remains," a voice whispered over the speakers. It wasn't the Admiral's commanding tone. It was a chorus of voices, layered and distorted, the sound of the others they had seen in the engine room. On the bridge, the sonar technician shouted in alarm. "Doctor, multiple contacts. They aren't on the seabed, they're rising." Vane rushed to the sonar screen. The display showed dozens of small, fast-moving blips ascending from the site of the U-2022. They weren't bubbles or debris. They were moving in a tight, predatory formation, following the exact path of the severed tether. The scavengers of the fold hadn't been trapped by the closing door. They had hitched a ride on the energy of the severance. They aren't coming for the ship, Vane realized, looking at the glowing red compass. They're coming for the needle. This compass isn't a gift, it's a homing beacon. The Admiral didn't throw it to save us. He threw it because it was the only part of the archive he could physically eject. Suddenly, the lights on the Orion began to flicker and dim. The red glow from the compass intensified, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls, shadows that seemed to move independently of the people casting them. The others were no longer just in the water. They were beginning to manifest in the very air around the crew. "Seal the lower decks," Vane commanded. "If they are scavengers of memory, we can't let them near the crew's quarters." But it was too late. The ship's hull groaned as if gripped by a massive, invisible hand. A thick, violet mist began to seep through the ventilation shafts. One by one, the electronic displays on the ship began to show images from 1945, grainy photos of the U-2022 crew, naval charts of the Baltic, and the face of Wilhelm von Zeller. The others were feeding on the ship's data, converting the digital history of the mission into a bridge to stabilize their forms in our world. In the center of the control room, the air began to tear. A vertical rift of violet light opened, and the temperature plummeted. From the rift, a hand emerged, not the Admiral's, but a long, translucent claw made of solidified shadow. It reached for the red compass in Vane's hand. If it reaches the surface, the door remains open. Vane remembered the Admiral's warning. He looked at the compass, then at the tech specialist. "The mercury, it's the weight. We need to neutralize the mercury." Vane ran to the ship's chemical lab, the shadow claw trailing inches behind his heels. He knew that mercury reacted violently with aluminum, but he needed something more, something to break the resonance of the fold. He grabbed a high-frequency acoustic welder used for hull repairs. If I can shatter the glass of the compass with the right frequency, the Mercury will lose its anchor, he yelled over the screeching of the rift. As he aimed the welder, the voice of the Admiral returned, but it was a scream of agony. Do not break it. If the Mercury spills, the fold will bleed into the fjord. You must return it to the deep. Give it back to the U. 2022. Vane froze. The others were inches away. If he broke the compass, he might destroy the beacon, or he might trigger a localized collapse of reality. If he threw it overboard, the entities would follow it down, but the door would remain ajar. Suddenly, the red needle stopped spinning. It pointed directly at Dr. Vane's chest. The compass wasn't just a beacon anymore. It had found its new anchor. It had found a living memory to feed on. The red needle didn't just point at Dr. Vane. It pulsed in sync with his heartbeat. The shadows in the room leaned inward, their faceless forms vibrating with a horrific, static-like hunger. Vane realized the Admiral's true, dark secret. The U-boat hadn't just been a vessel for gold or archives. It was a vessel for human consciousness. To survive the fold, the Admiral had merged his memories with the Mercury. Now, the Mercury had chosen Vane as its next host. It's not looking for a place, Vane gasped, his vision beginning to blur into a violet haze. It's looking for a witness. It needs a living mind to anchor itself in this century. The others lunged. The shadow claw brushed Vane's shoulder, and instantly, a flood of 1945 memories surged into his brain. The smell of diesel, the sound of depth charges, the crushing weight of a sinking sub. He wasn't just Julian Vane anymore. He was becoming the U. 2022. Julian, throw it. The tech specialist screamed, but Vane was frozen. If he threw the compass into the water, the scavengers would follow it and remain in the fjord, slowly feeding on the town nearby. If he kept it, he would be consumed. Vane looked at the high-frequency acoustic welder in his hand. He remembered the Admiral's warning. If the Mercury spills, the fold will bleed. But there was a third option. The lead cylinder, Vane whispered. He realized that the Orion carried a heavy, lead-lined containment chamber used for transporting radioactive isotopes found in deep-sea wreckage. Lead was the only material that had successfully contained the blue pulse for 77 years. With a burst of adrenaline, Vane sprinted toward the containment deck, the entities trailing behind him like a dark cape. The air was screaming, the ship's metal groaning as the rift widened. He reached the lead chamber, a thick, coffin-like box bolted to the deck. He threw the glowing red compass inside. The moment the lid slammed shut, the screaming stopped. The violet mist evaporated as if it had never existed. The shadow claw dissipated into harmless dust. The red needle's connection to Vane's mind was severed so abruptly, he collapsed to his knees, gasping for air that finally felt like oxygen again. The ship fell silent. The lights stabilized. The sonar screen showed nothing. The blips had vanished. The scavengers, deprived of their beacon, had been snapped back into the closing rift. 3 days later, the Orion docked in a private military port. The lead chamber was taken by a team of men in unmarked suits. Men who didn't ask questions and didn't offer names. Dr. Vane stood on the pier, watching the sunset. He was officially on leave for psychiatric reasons. The public report stated that the U-boat discovery was a hoax, a misidentified geological formation. But as Vane reached into his pocket to find a lighter, his fingers brushed against something cold and smooth. He pulled it out. It was a small, rusted iron key. One of the keys they had seen suspended in the Mercury engine of the U. 2022. He hadn't picked it up. It shouldn't be there. He looked back at the ocean. The water was calm, but for a split second, the reflection of the sun on the waves didn't look orange. It looked violet. A low-frequency hum vibrated in his teeth. The Admiral had been a man of his word. He had kept the archive safe. But the archive wasn't a map of the past. It was a countdown for the future. And somewhere, deep in the fold, the other thousands who had fled in 1945 were still looking for an anchor. Vane looked at the key, then threw it as far as he could into the dark water. But even as it sank, he knew, some things don't stay under.